oui, effectivement, comme vous le voyez, j'ai quelques notes. Je pensais à tort que, passé 50 ans, je serais comme le vin, je me bonifierais, mais non, je porte des lunettes et je suis obligé de prendre des notes car je perds la mémoire. Remarquez que certaines fois, ça peut nous arranger de perdre la mémoire. Donc, plus sérieusement, nous avons aujourd'hui l'honneur et le privilège d'accueillir un des plus importants économistes au monde dans la personne de M. John Lipsky. Je voudrais un tonnerre d'applaudissements pour la personne qu'il est. Monsieur Lipsky donc, a été de 2006 à 2011 premier directeur général adjoint du Fonds monétaire international et en a été directeur général donc, en 2011. Il participe tout au long de l'année à des conférences à travers le monde. Il a accepté à ma demande d'intervenir à titre amical à Sauve, qui est à quelques kilomètres de sa résidence en Cévennes.
Among the advanced economies, the United States growth currently is the fastest, while the other advanced economies are lagging behind. At Jackson Hole, Madame Lagarde mentioned that it might be more accurate to speak of a 4 or even 5-speed global economy, as there is today substantial divergence in the growth prospects among both advanced and emerging economies. Specifically, the IMF is forecasting that global growth will be about 3.1% this year, the same as last year, accelerating to about 3.8% next year. Within this total, the advanced economies will grow only about 1.2%, also the same as last year, but 2.1% next year, reflecting stronger expected growth in the United States and in the Eurozone. Emerging economies are expected to grow 5% this year, just slightly faster than last year, and by 5.4% next year, with China expected to grow by 7.8% this year and 7.7% next year. Of course, this performance must be viewed in context. Even for the more rapidly growing emerging economies, this forecast implies that growth will remain below its long-term average, even 6 years after the onset of the global financial crisis. For the advanced economies, the outlook is particularly frustrating, in fact, quite disturbing, because among the key advanced economies, only in the United States is output clearly above pre-crisis levels. Moreover, unemployment rates remain high, including in the United States, and the total number of employed in most advanced economies is still lower than prior to the onset of the crisis in 2008. No wonder people are dissatisfied. This unsatisfactory situation underscores just how difficult it has been to overcome the impact of the great financial crisis. After all, having formed the G20 leaders process in response to the crisis, these countries, together with others, applied the greatest simultaneous economic stimulus ever attempted. Fiscal deficits soared as spending was boosted, while tax revenues dropped sharply. Central banks cut interest rates massively while supplying unprecedented amounts of liquidity. The G20 provided $1 trillion in new anti-crisis funding to the IMF and other international institutions. At least this effort rather quickly stopped the downward momentum, and in the view of most experts, prevented a much more severe and long-lasting downturn. However, it has been more difficult than expected to produce a more comprehensive cure for the global economy. Let's think for a moment why this has been the case. The crisis followed a period of unprecedented global growth. Among other things, the rapid expansion of the emerging economies prior to the crisis was the greatest anti-poverty program in history, as literally hundreds of millions of people in places like India and China and elsewhere overcame a long legacy of extreme poverty, in most cases thanks to their economy's new linkages to a buoyant global market. However, we can see in retrospect that this unprecedented global growth was spurred in part by overly rapid demand growth, especially in the United States and in parts of Europe, fueled in most cases by unprecedented credit growth and excessive leverage. In other words, it was an expansion built on a very shaky foundation. Thus, the anti-crisis efforts of the Group of 20 and others has been designed to shore up the walls of the house while at the same time repairing or even rebuilding the foundation. And this has been attempted amidst worries about the risk of new floods or earthquakes. So it is not surprising that this effort has been difficult, even when there has been broad agreement about what caused the crisis and what needs to be done to overcome it. Of course, the hardest part has been rebuilding the global economy's foundations. In the emerging economies, this has required making structural reforms that improve efficiency and productivity, while in many cases reorienting the economy away from a reliance on export growth and undervalued exchange rates and toward more robust domestic demand and a sound financial system. But the need for rebuilding also applies to the advanced economies. In Japan, for example, this has meant overcoming the unique challenge of a shrinking population, persistent deflation, and the dual economy structure of a world-class manufacturing sector existing side by side with an inefficient service sector. In the United States, the challenge has been to accommodate a needed decline in real estate prices and to reduce household borrowing, while restoring the health of the financial sector and boosting the competitiveness of sections of the manufacturing sector, such as in motor vehicle production. In most cases, this has been accomplished by allowing market forces to work. After all, about 80% of business borrowing in the United States takes place in the capital markets, that is, through the sale of bonds or equities, rather than through traditional bank borrowing. Capital markets can be brutal in forcing adjustment, but they tend to accomplish their goals. As a result, U.S. corporations have made very painful adjustments, such that in the aggregate today, they enjoy record profits, low leverage, and comfortable cash positions. Progress has been much slower in sectors like housing, where the involvement of public policy is pervasive through government-chartered home mortgage agencies. Thus, it took almost 6 years for the average house price in the United States to adjust to a more sustainable reality. It's not surprising that household spending began to strengthen notably only once average house prices stopped declining last year. This isn't to say that the U.S. economy doesn't face notable challenges, including weak employment and income growth, alongside increased inequality in income and wealth. So even with all the progress made, growth remains weaker than had been hoped. First, The creation of the single currency was intended to bind the Eurozone economy together very directly, but it also was expected to force the necessary structural reforms and integration that would convert the zone into what economists call an optimal currency area. In other words, the single currency was expected to force a convergence in underlying economic performance, at least to a reasonable degree, that would make the single currency economically viable and sustainable. Thus, businesses throughout the Eurozone would have to compete in a common currency, guaranteeing, or so it was hoped, an equalization of their underlying efficiency. Secondly, the euro was expected to provide the catalyst for the creation of a single Eurozone financial market, further enhancing efficiency. Nonetheless, until the crisis hit, there was limited progress toward constructing a single financial sector authority, including powers of regulation, supervision, deposit insurance, and resolution, alongside the monetary policy authority of the European Central Bank. But in an economy that is highly dependent on traditional bank lending for financing enterprises, this created stability risks. In fact, this danger had been recognized long before the crisis. However, a lack of political will to surrender sovereign privileges over national financial markets seemed to hold back progress until the crisis made clear the need for rapid improvement. Thirdly, the very slow decision-making process within the European Union made it difficult to make rapid policy choices, even under severe pressure. In many ways, this is understandable. Think how long it took for the Euro members to decide what to do to address the dramatic developments in Greece. However, the logic of the crisis has been both powerful and insistent. Without greater confidence in the capability of European Union governance to reach effective conclusions, it will be hard to achieve the goal of making the European economy as efficient and productive as any global competitor. As it turned out, weaknesses in the European financial sector played a critical role in creating the global crisis. For example, fully one-half of so-called U.S. toxic housing assets ended up on European bank balance sheets. In other words, a substantial proportion of the funding of unsound U.S. subprime mortgages was provided by European institutions. They were key enablers of this kind of unsustainable lending, right alongside their American counterparts. Moreover, following rules that decreed that Eurozone sovereign debt effectively was risk-free, European banks purchased large amounts of sovereign debt of the peripheral Eurozone countries at interest rates that suggested that Greek government bonds, for example, were no more risky than that of the core countries. In this way, the implied market discipline of the single currency was subverted, allowing the peripheral economies to accumulate public debt while avoiding the necessary structural reforms that were a key motivation for creating the euro in the first place. Today, these key weaknesses are being addressed, and all at the same time, but at the price of an initial deep economic downturn, a severe crisis of historic proportions in the peripheral economies, and a prolonged and painfully weak recovery marked by high and still rising unemployment rates. Happily, the latest Eurozone economic data indicate that there is a modest upturn underway across the zone. I interpret this to reflect a cyclical improvement that is taking place despite the very incomplete process of reform. So optimism will have to remain constrained, I'm afraid. The future of the Eurozone, in fact, of the European Union as a whole, is a very important but very complex topic. I'll be happy to take any questions later on this subject that you wish, but at this point, I will just say that while many difficult adjustments in policies and governance will be necessary to achieve success, I cannot imagine that a significant fragmentation of either the Eurozone or of the European Union itself would open the way to any additional near-term progress in economic, financial, or even social terms. There is no doubt that the path will continue to be difficult and challenging, but I simply don't see a better alternative at this point, and eventual success would be hugely beneficial. Turning now to France, there are obvious problems, but obvious strengths. According to the latest IMF projections, the French economy is expected to contract very slightly this year, about 0.2%, and grow only slightly next year, less than 1%. Excellent social infrastructure and a cadre of world-class large enterprises are important strengths of the French economy. The banking system is in relatively good shape, despite low profitability and a reliance on wholesale funding. However, excessive rigidities and controls of all kinds, especially with regard to new business formation in labor markets and in markets for services, have held back French ingenuity and thwarted productivity gains, thus damaging France's external competitiveness. As a result, France's external market share has been in decline. High social charges have limited incentive for new hiring, while other practices continue to create a labor market that produces insider-outsider inequalities that protect formal job holders while creating high barriers to entry for new workers. Of course, this encourages high rates of youth unemployment, with long-term negative implications for growth and efficiency, not to mention heightened social strains. At the same time, the excellent social infrastructure is reflected in the exceptionally high proportion of French GDP accounted for by public sector spending. So far, the post-crisis attempt to restore better budgetary balance within the framework of the Stability and Growth Pact has involved substantial increases in government revenues. For example, the improvement in the structural budget balance in France achieved during 2011 to this year has totaled 3.7% of GDP from revenue increases, but only about 0.3% in expenditure restraints. Naturally, this has tended to limit both business investment and new hiring. Lack of growth in jobs and wages limit income gains, thereby limiting new consumption spending. In fairness, the government has recognized the need for increased labor market flexibility, along with reductions in the cost of hiring. This is the essence of the flexicurity reforms being implemented and the planned indirect reduction in labor charges through the tax credit on firms' wage payments. Whether these measures will be sufficient to encourage significant new hiring remains to be seen, as there appears to be substantial uncertainty about just how these measures will work out in practice. Increased flexibility in markets for products and services also has been recognized widely as potential sources for French economic improvement. However, specific plans in this regard remain somewhat vague at this point, so far as I understand. Of course, I am somewhat embarrassed to be telling you all this, as I'm certain that most of you could provide much greater detail about these reform issues than I am, as you face them every day. And after all, these are not new issues. However, the big picture is very clear. French citizens can have all the social services they wish to pay for. But the only way to sustain high social spending, together with high and growing private income, is to improve French economic productivity and efficiency. You all know this. You can't get something for nothing. You also all know that increased government borrowing relative to GDP and or new taxes on a subset of the population is not likely to produce the desired outcome. There have to be gains in productivity and efficiency through increased flexibility and new investment. A few final words about the Gare. To be very frank, I am very optimistic regarding the region's opportunities. Perhaps I'm a bit naive, but I think of this area of being like a mini Silicon Valley. By the way, both my wife and I are graduates of Stanford University at the heart of the original Silicon Valley, so I guess I have some idea about what this means. Wonderful weather, the Mediterranean beaches nearby, the beautiful landscapes of the Cevennes and the Languedoc more broadly make this an attractive area to live and to visit. The cost of living is relatively low. Excellent universities already have attracted both existing firms and new startups in electronics, information technology, biomedical technology. Improved application of agricultural technologies and a more enlightened approach to marketing is improving the quality of the region's wines and expanding their markets. For example, I now regularly find wines of the Pic Saint-Loup in my neighborhood wine store in Brooklyn, New York. Moreover, the infrastructure for tourism continues to improve as a drive through the region makes clear. Who would have thought that Corcón would start to offer some of the kinds of attractions and facilities that are associated typically with a place like Beaune? Or am I getting a bit too carried away? Seriously though, it strikes me that this region should be a big beneficiary of the fiscal and structural reforms that we have been discussing as necessary for France, especially if they succeed in increasing economic flexibility and therefore enhancing the environment for new business formation. There's still a long way to go before private equity, angel investors, and startup financial infrastructure in this region starts to resemble Silicon Valley itself. But why not head that way? After all, today's temperature in Sauve isn't that much different from that in Palo Alto, California. Why can't the business environment be as favorable here as well?
Bonsoir, good evening. André Tessier-Lucro, président Comité Bastille. Je demande à Gareth Jenkins la permission de poser ma question à la fois en français et en anglais. I ask permission from Gareth to ask my question in both English and French. La raison étant que je suis à peu près bilingue. Je suis citoyen américain en même temps que français et je connais l'anglais de l'économie. The reason being that I'm about bilingual. I lived 26 years in the US and I speak economic English. Alors voilà ma question. Elle est assez simple et il faut que je la maintienne simple parce qu'elle est très importante. Here is my question. It is quite simple and I will try and keep it simple because it's very important. Vous avez dit justement que l'Amérique est sortie de la crise plus rapidement et à retrouver la croissance plus rapidement que l'Europe. You said very rightly that the US came out of the crisis faster and recovered with growth faster. Et vous expliquez ceci comme étant une évidence favorable parce que vous considérez que le retour de la croissance est a priori la qualité unique à rechercher. And you present this as a favorable element because you think that recovery of growth is the absolute goal that we should pursue. Je vais vous proposer la question suivante. La France bénéficie d'une espérance de vie de 81 ans. The French benefit of a life expectancy of 81 years. Les États-Unis d'une espérance de vie de seulement 78 ans. The US have a life expectancy of only 78 years, roughly 3 years less than the French. Je vous propose que le prix que l'Amérique paye pour maintenir la croissance, pour réaliser cette flexibilité dont vous parlez, c'est des millions et des millions d'Américains qui meurent, en gros, 3 ans plus tôt que les Français. I put it to you that the cost that the United States pay for that higher flexibility, more brutal change of the financial markets is the millions of Americans who die 3 years earlier than the French. John Lipsky me demande s'il meurt plus jeune, est-ce qu'il ne meurt pas plus heureux? And I will answer to you that happiness is not an economic parameter. It is not something that you can quantify. And I'll give you an example. Je lui réponds que le bonheur n'est pas une mesure pas quelque chose qu'on peut mesurer en termes économiques. Et je vais lui en donner un exemple. Take 2 countries which are neighbors in Europe, France and Belgium. Prenez la France et la Belgique qui sont des voisins en Europe. They had very parallel history and they have very similar economies. Ils ont eu des histoires très parallèles et ils ont des économies très similaires. Quand on demande à des Français et à des Belges, êtes-vous heureux? Les Français disent non et les Belges disent ah oui, ça va pas si mal, sais-tu? Autrement dit, in other words, the perception of happiness is totally different in a country like France or Italy than in a country like Belgium or Holland. You see? And therefore, I put it to you because you are an economist, et par conséquent, je vous dis, parce que vous êtes un économiste, vous ne devez pas considérer que le bonheur puisse se mesurer. You cannot consider that happiness could be measurable.
Well, yes. This is going to get philosophical.
Precisely.
Yes.
Ça devient philosophique.
But certainly, the concept of happiness does underlie economic analysis. It's not foreign. It doesn't make it simple, but obviously the goal of economic progress is, in fact, happiness, however measured.
Alors, je vais traduire la question, mais ensuite, je vais demander à Gareth de vous passer la parole parce que je voudrais transmettre le message de John comme une question à vous tous. John dit, le bonheur et la prospérité économique ont tout de même une certaine tendance à progresser ensemble. Et on peut tout de même, pour nous économistes, supposer qu'une croissance de l'économie va se traduire en gros par plus de possibilités de bonheur pour la population. Et par conséquent, je demande s'il y a quelqu'un dans la salle qui a une réponse, soit pour soutenir John, soit pour présenter une objection. D'accord?
So he's now asking if there's anyone in the hall who will support either you or him.
Well, who knows? But we shouldn't go too far with this.
No.
But it's not it's a serious point.
Very.
It is not a proposition of the economics profession that wealth equals happiness. in fact, what we purport to measure by measuring the economy is to measure utility, which is a form of satisfaction or happiness. Of course, it's a concept that will remain elusive, but I think it is a mistake to assume that economists or economic analysis suggests that material wealth is the absolute goal.
Alors, il me dit que sans considérer de passer à un débat philosophique, on peut tout de même considérer que l'utilité d'un développement économique, un développement qui devient plus utile au lieu de moins utile, doit normalement entraîner plus de satisfaction de la part de la population. On n'est pas obligé d'appeler cette satisfaction bonheur. Alors, j'ajoute ici que John Lipsky est évidemment, comme tout économiste anglo-saxon, un étudiant de John Stuart Mills, philosophe anglais, qui avait inventé l'utilitarianisme en philosophie, et considérant que la grande vertu, plutôt que de s'interroger sur des buts éthiques fondamentaux, la grande vertu d'une société est de progresser vers l'utilité. C'est un point sur lequel les Anglais sont plus souvent d'accord que les Français. Je ne fais que la remarque.
Merci, André.
Very good.
Non, c'est un... Merci, André.
Let me add 2 points.
Alors, John va ajouter 2 choses.
One, my Lipsky ancestors would be very shocked to hear me called Anglo-Saxon.
Les ancêtres de John Lipsky seraient très étonnés, choqués qu'André l'appelle anglo-saxon.
And let me also be clear that in my presentation, I certainly was not trying to suggest all was well in the United States and all was problematic in France. Far from it.
Dans la présentation, je ne voulais point suggérer que tout était merveilleux aux États-Unis et le contraire à l'Europe.
At the same time, I think it is clear that most French people think that the French economy could work better and better serve the French people.
Mais c'est un fait que la plupart des Français y pensent, sont de l'avis que l'économie pourrait marcher mieux.
Bonjour, Nicolas Rességuier, je suis directeur de la Banque de France pour le Gard. Merci beaucoup pour cette conférence passionnante et aussi pour la question que j'ai bien aimée, parce qu'en effet c'est un débat intéressant et je crois que les économistes n'ont pas toutes les clés et moi qui travaille dans une structure économique, je le dis d'autant plus librement. Et c'est vrai que cette idée de bonheur et de prospérité matérielle, bon, ça mérite en effet un débat. Et d'ailleurs, il y a d'autres indicateurs. On le sait que le produit intérieur brut pour mesurer le bonheur, notamment les indicateurs de développement humain, par exemple, hein, qui intègrent en particulier l'espérance de vie. D'ailleurs, donc je trouve que la remarque de monsieur est tout à fait pertinente. C'est vrai que tout n'est pas, la croissance n'égale pas le bonheur. Donc c'est un débat intéressant. Alors, je voulais néanmoins intervenir.
Non, pas de problème.
Je voulais faire un commentaire sur la zone euro, nuancer peut-être un peu votre point de vue, et puis vous poser une question sur l'économie américaine. Sur la zone euro, donc, je pense que vous avez souligné à juste titre que la zone euro manque encore d'intégration politique, on pourrait dire, et qu'il y a tout cet aspect justement décisionnel. Vous avez souligné par exemple la lenteur des décisions, et vous avez bien raison. Et donc à côté de la monnaie européenne, qui est un grand acquis, on n'a pas assez vite avancé sur le pendant, je dirais, politique. Alors c'est vrai, et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous, néanmoins la crise, et c'est aussi la vertu de la crise, parfois accélère un peu les mutations. Et de ce point de vue-là, il y a quand même quelques avancées, insuffisantes certes, mais quelques avancées qui sont intervenues depuis 2-3 ans. Je citerai par exemple le fait qu'on ait mis en place enfin, ce qu'on aurait dû faire plus tôt, c'est vrai, des systèmes de contrôle des déficits budgétaires, donc une discipline plus rigoureuse qui devrait éviter les errements du passé, en tout cas les réduire. Autre exemple, le fonds européen, le FESF, le Fonds européen qui permet d'emprunter pas cher grâce à la force de l'Europe et de l'euro et de reprêter aux autres pays qui, s'ils empruntaient tout seuls, je pense à la Grèce ou à l'Espagne, etc., l'Italie, emprunteraient très cher, donc une sorte de mutualisation de la dette publique qui, là encore, n'en est qu'à ses balbutiements, donc il y a des débats, hein, est-ce qu'il faut aller plus loin? Moi, en tant que citoyen, moi, je le pense. Et puis une troisième illustration de ces progrès, encore insuffisants, qui sont en cours, c'est la supervision bancaire européenne qu'on est en train de mettre en place. Hein, et dans les mois qui viennent, normalement, ça devrait fonctionner. Donc on va contrôler les banques au niveau européen, ce qui est une exigence, car évidemment, ça fait bien longtemps que les frontières nationales en Europe n'ont plus beaucoup de sens pour le système bancaire. Donc pour être efficace, le contrôle doit être au moins européen. Et d'ailleurs, vous l'avez peut-être vu dans la presse, le patron probable de cette grande structure de contrôle bancaire européenne sera une Française, une femme qui à l'heure actuelle dirige le contrôle bancaire français, ce qui est à la fois évidemment un satisfecit pour les femmes qui sont toujours pas assez nombreuses dans ces assemblées, mais aussi pour le contrôle bancaire français. Voilà, donc on avance un peu, pas assez vite, mais on avance un peu. Et puis la question que je voulais vous poser, c'est sur l'économie américaine et l'ajustement budgétaire. On sait bien qu'une des difficultés, un des défis des économies occidentales, toutes les économies occidentales, c'est l'importance de la dette publique. Et cet assainissement budgétaire, évidemment, est compliqué, il est trop rapide, pas assez rapide, donc il freine la croissance. Et aux États-Unis, on a du mal, en tout cas moi j'ai du mal à voir s'il y a vraiment assainissement budgétaire, comment ça se passe. On a l'impression qu'il ne se passe pas grand-chose et qu'en tout cas ça gêne moins la croissance qu'en Europe. Alors, est-ce que ça veut dire que les Américains peuvent se permettre en permanence d'avoir un déficit budgétaire et une dette publique qui augmente éternellement, ce qui pose quand même un certain nombre de problèmes? Comment vous voyez donc cet assainissement budgétaire aux États-Unis et ses conséquences? Merci.
The rise in the U.S. budget deficit in the wake of the crisis was mainly due to automatic stabilizers, or was not due to the discretionary decisions to provide new stimulus. As a result, the political, or not as a result, at the same time, the political discussion made it seem as though the rise in the deficit was due to decisions made to provide stimulus. However, two decisions, very important decisions, were taken in the last year or so. One was to make the tax cuts enacted back in the Bush administration permanent for 98% of taxpayers. And also a decision to make significant cuts in defense spending over the next 10 years. Together, these measures plus the acceleration in U.S. growth means that the U.S. federal deficit will have fallen next year to probably under 4% of GDP. So it will be similar to that of France.
À peu près comme la France.
But without a doubt, with our populations aging in both countries and with promises made to provide health and retirement income, health services and retirement income to retirees, both our countries will face long-term challenges. So both countries will face important decisions on policies in the years ahead.
Bonjour, Guillaume Mollin, je suis journaliste. J'avais pas de réflexion, mais trois questions. La première, je voulais savoir s'il y avait un vrai risque d'explosion de la zone euro.
Quoi?
Un vrai risque d'explosion ou d'implosion de la zone euro. La deuxième, je voulais savoir si une politique qui favorisait l'augmentation des impôts au détriment de la réduction du train de vie de l'État était favorable au retour d'une croissance rapide et durable. Est-ce qu'une politique qui privilégie l'augmentation rising tax des impôts plutôt instead of cutting costs permet le retour d'une croissance durable et rapide. Et enfin, la troisième, plus politique, je voulais savoir s'il y avait une différence, vous avez travaillé avec les deux, je voulais savoir s'il y avait une différence dans l'approche de l'économie mondiale entre Dominique Strauss-Kahn et Christine Lagarde.
And she is highly